So welcome everybody. We are this morning finishing the stories of Rabbi Eliezer, son of Hyrcanus, one of the great rabbinic figures, and really there have been entire books written about this one figure because of his imprint in these stories that we were reading. And so maybe a quick recap. Right, Eliezer was born into a wealthy family in the north of Israel, right in the years around the destruction. He was one of the very early rabbis. He was a student. He ended up being a student of Rabban Johanan ben Zakkai, who witnessed the destruction of the temple. So Rabbi Eliezer, he was there at that moment of the apocalypse. And he lived up in the Galilee. His father was a wealthy landowner, but obviously not very religious Jewish family. His father has a Greek name, Hyrcanus. It's not always telling you how assimilated they were, but he didn't study any Torah. So obviously his father didn't value him studying Torah. And suddenly he was 22 and set to inherit with his brothers, his father's wealth. And he suddenly started to think, hey, I want to study some Torah. And his father laughed at him and said, "You want to study some Torah? You're already too old. If you want to go marry someone and have your children study Torah." But he had a thirst that he himself couldn't quench by listening to his father and having his children study. And so, despite what his father said, and he's kind of a deep feeling man, because from this. He weeps over times through all these stories. When his father says he can't study, he weeps. And then when he thinks about not being able to study Torah, he weeps. And eventually his father says, why don't you go and do some agricultural work? That will make you feel more connected to what you're doing here instead of thinking about these lofty ideas. That's why I always think of this story as a kind of a musical, the son who wanted to go out into the world and wanted to sing and this and anyhow. So, but he gives up the agricultural life and runs up to Jerusalem and decides to study Torah and gives everything to it. He doesn't even think about eating. He doesn't ask for money to eat. He has no money. And for 8 days he knows what he wants. He goes straight to the most important sage, Johanan ben Zakkai, and says, I want to study Torah. He says, what do you know? Nothing. You teach him the Shema, and then he learns the Shema, and then he learns a little bit of Mishnah. Whatever he takes in, he soaks it in. He's got such a thirst. He just deeply soaks in more and more and more Torah, until finally years have passed. And in the meantime, he's recognized even 8 days later by the rabbi as being a genius. And the rabbi notices he has bad breath, and he says, have you been eating properly? And he remains silent, and he goes and inquires and finds out he hasn't been eating anything for 8 days because he's too humble to ask for money, and he's just been so preoccupied with this new Torah he's learning. And so this is the kind of character he is. He's totally into it. And then 3 years later, his father comes, and his father wants to disinherit him because his son has been absent, and he knows he's in Jerusalem studying Torah, but it happens to be that the most important rabbi of Jerusalem is setting up a feast to present his protege to the world and invite all the noble people of Jerusalem. And suddenly his father is seated with some of the greatest nobles of their time, trembling because he's wealthy, but he's not one of the great nobles. And who is but his son, who's presented as the great genius? And at first the son says, I can't share Torah among these amazing notables, but Rabbi Johanan says, just do what you do. And suddenly he starts to talk. And when he starts to talk, there's Torah like nobody's ever heard before. And his father is wowed, and he sees these nobles honoring his son. And it's a great story. And finally his son is recognized and made, accepted. And then his son is, they say, they were there all day and night because of the stuff he was saying. And then we get to the middle part of this story, which is him building up his reputation, and thousands of students come his way, and even some of the other greats of his peers. There's a story of he had to stand up on stone lectern because so many people came to hear his words. And one of his peers, the great Rabbi Joshua, once came and kissed the stone because he said, this stone is like Mount Sinai to me, and Rabbi Eliezer is like Moses, and everything that Rabbi Eliezer takes in, he's like nothing goes by. And Rabbi Eliezer himself, is such a humble guy that he would say, "There's nothing I teach I haven't learned from my own teachers." And he has like 30 points of law for every little discussion of every little minute point of halacha that he learns and transmits. But then we also start to discover that as he ages and becomes a teacher, he's more conservative religiously, and he's a little judgmental of the people who aren't like him. He's the first one to arrive in the study hall, the last one to leave. And so there's a story of him, and he's seeing other people leave before him, and he's kind of saying they're flakes, and the more, people aren't like him, he says they're not worth much, and then only the people who stay as long as he stays, he says, okay, you're worth something. And then we get to the great big story. And this is a story that kind of defines his generation, which is what's called the Yavne generation, right? Because these are the rabbis who went to Yavne after the destruction of Jerusalem and saved Jerusalem. And this story is the story of a little minute point of halacha. This is the oven of Achnai, an oven that he considered to be pure, but all the other rabbis considered to render things impure. And he says, no, you guys are wrong. And, he's the great Rabbi Eliezer who knows everything. And he says, you're all wrong about it. But all of his other peers say, you know what? We consider this to be pure, and we don't accept what you are debating. So Rabbi Eliezer says, well, if the halacha is like me, let this tree be uprooted. And the tree is suddenly uprooted out of a divine miracle. And they say, we don't make our halacha according to trees being uprooted. And he says, oh, you think that's something? If I'm right, let the rivers show it. And saying the river runs backwards. And they say, we don't follow the halacha according to rivers. And then he says, oh, really? Well, if the halacha is like me, let the walls of the study hall prove it. So the walls start to cave in. And at that moment, one of the other rabbis stands up and says to the walls, why are you getting involved in this matter of dispute? Don't you know that this is a matter between the sages and you have nothing to do with it? And so the walls stay at a 45-degree angle, kind of a symbol for what's going on that day, the disruption. But he still isn't done. For him to be right, because he really feels he's right, he's willing to take it even further. He says, if I am right, let a voice from heaven come and let everybody know that I'm right. And suddenly the voice from heaven resounds and says, don't you know that he's right? Why are you disputing him? The halacha is always like him. But then one of the other rabbis suddenly chimes in and talks to the voice from heaven and says, why are you getting involved? It says in the book of Deuteronomy, Lo bashamayim hi, it is not in heaven. It is decided according to the majority of the sages. And at that moment, the voice said, okay, I'm staying out of this. And then right after that, there's this brilliant passage where one of the rabbis was present in that very tense moment, meets Elijah the prophet and asks Elijah, what was God doing at this moment? And he says, God was laughing and saying, you have beaten me, my sons, you have beaten me. But after that, they excommunicated Rabbi Eliezer. And there was a very difficult decision to excommunicate the great Rabbi Eliezer. But I guess they felt it was the right thing to do. And there's only one person they could send, and that's Rabbi Akiba to do it, because Rabbi Akiba has this ongoing relationship. He's another genius, who started studying Torah later in life. And so he goes to see Rabbi Eliezer, and he goes dressed all in black like a mourner. And he says, why are you all dressed in black, Rabbi Akiba? And then Rabbi Akiba lets him know in a gentle way, but still, because when Rabbi Eliezer finds out, then suddenly it affects the whole world. 1/3 of the entire olive harvest is destroyed, and 1/3 of the entire barley harvest is destroyed. And a huge wave starts to go across the Mediterranean. And on the ship is Rabban Gamliel, who's the head of the Sanhedrin, right? Who was obviously present that day when he was excommunicated, and the wave is about to take him out. And then Rabban Gamliel speaks to the wave and says, "Don't you know what I'm trying to do? I'm doing this for the sake of Judaism." And so the wave stops. But then after that, Rabban Gamliel is married to the sister of Rabbi Eliezer. The wife of Rabbi Eliezer is the sister of Rabban Gamliel. And so the wife of Rabbi Eliezer is really worried every time her husband has been excommunicated. If at some point he gets on the ground and starts praying to God, God will take his side and kill her brother because her brother was involved in the excommunication. And then suddenly, and she stops her husband from praying, except for one day, she's not able to stop him. And her husband prays to God and falls on his face. And suddenly her brother dies at that moment because of the power of this poor excommunicated man who's been sent away. So really rich story, right? It's an amazing story about many things. And one of the things that it's about, we were talking about, is the fact that Judaism in this fork in the road took a specific direction, a very courageous direction, which was to start to go by following reason, following the majority, following what the rabbis decide, and saying that people like Rabbi Eliezer, who are kind of mavericks, even those who say they're speaking in the name of God, we can't follow them if we don't think it's good for the community. We're doing what's best for the community. And this is a departure from any other tradition and from what else was going on. But there was also something in my mind, at least, that was lost, which was, following the people like Rabbi Eliezer, who are the spiritual giants and the intellectual giants. And so it's kind of like it's a movement away from religious conservatism. It's about, we've got to do what's best for us at this moment. They made an example of him, right? They excommunicated the man who they considered to be like Moses, which is a pretty bold move. This is the same day that all the other things have happened and other stories. So I've been talking for 15 minutes, but I wanted to recall all of that as we're going to get into the end of his life. Anybody have any remaining thoughts or comments or anything from the last few weeks and from this whole story?
The oven thing is very interesting, of course. This is a certain puzzle. This isn't a real oven, as it's stated. This is a certain puzzle that has to do with boundaries. And it has to do with whether the oven has boundaries or whether it doesn't have boundaries. If it has boundaries, then anything inside it can be impure. If it doesn't have boundaries, I assume that that's the opposite. But anyway, Rabbi Eliezer spends a lot of time on this and thinks about this a lot. And through thinking about that particular puzzle, I believe ends up having some supernatural powers. And we're seeing, and now what he brings to these supernatural powers is sort of a small-mindedness, unfortunately, a rage at being wrong, not being able to really appreciate other people's point of view. So he gets very, very angry a lot. And that's when he gets angry, it turns out that with his supernatural powers, I would leave God out of this, actually. I think he just has supernatural powers independently of something divine, not quite that, but close. So he ends up destroying certain things. Now, I don't know why what the reason he was excommunicated. Was he excommunicated for using his supernatural powers inappropriately? Could that have been it? I mean, why would you excommunicate a guy like this? I know why Spinoza was excommunicated, because he had certain heresies that he was really into. This guy wasn't into heresies. What was he into that was so bad?
Well, there is a story that I wasn't going to read. Maybe we'll read it, where he is accused of a heresy. But you're right, it's not heresy, but I think he almost caused the walls of the study hall to collapse, right? Like, because through his force of character, he almost jeopardized the whole basis of what they were doing, which was based on, all the rabbis considering each other and talking to each other and compromising and coming to the majority. And he was willing, as you were saying, to just use his spiritual powers in a destructive way. I mean, the only kind of other parallel is maybe, okay, Moses is not allowed to enter the promised land because he hits a rock. When you have spiritual powers, if you don't use them correctly, then there are consequences that are sometimes harsh because you have a power to destroy. I mean, he literally had the walls come down on the study hall, and they were never quite the same afterwards, right? They stayed at 45-degree angles, so to speak, after it. But I think he's excommunicated because he felt he was right. And maybe part of that was because of his mystical powers. He felt, maybe he didn't have a voice that told him, though even the story does say that he did, but he felt sure of himself. He felt he was right and they were just being stubborn. But their sense was, we have to build our rabbinic enterprise based on consensus. And if you have one rabbi who's refusing to accept our consensus, then we can't live with that. I don't know, anybody else?
Well, says he was the smartest guy in the room. His attitude towards women who they're okay to marry, but you never listen to them because they're not worth listening to. And then his attitude towards the people that work in his house, his servants, and why would you mourn for a servant? They're not worth anything. You can just replace them. I think I would be on the excommunicating committee.
Yeah, going back to last week when he had lacked any humanism, any sense of the feelings of his fellow human beings or fellow co-religionists. And this puzzle with the oven, to me, seems, you said there was 10 coils. Would those be the 10 commandments? And then they're covered in a plaster to hold them together, or you don't hold them together?
I don't think I think if you think about this stuff, you shouldn't think about symbols. You should think about analogies.
Right.
These things are much more available to analogies. So this is a cube, this oven, and it has snakes coiling inside of it. It has spirals inside of it through the wire, and they're separate. And they're separated by the sand. And the issue is whether the thing is open or closed, whether it's an open system or a closed system. I think that's what they're struggling with that.
I think the problems have to do with so many different interpretations of the oven that they call that the oven's name was a snake.
Well, in language is too.
Well, the oven is also, right, a powerful symbol because it's saying, what do you do with this, right? These are all Torah laws about what's pure and impure, right? And if it's impure, what do you have to do to the oven? You take it and it's no longer worth anything, you break it. So the rabbis are saying this oven, the symbol of what the received tradition maybe, we have to break it and create a new oven because it's no longer good for us. And he's saying, no, I want to preserve the oven. The oven is still valuable. So maybe there's also some kind of, talking about his whole thing is wanting to conserve the tradition, every single law that came, and they're more willing to be creative and change things around. And he's not willing to go to their length to change the tradition. So there could be something about that, about there too. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I want to ask a specific question about the text, but first I just want to drop a little quibbling footnote to what David said. I don't think during his lifetime that Maimonides was excommunicated. I could be wrong, but I don't. I know that after his death, in some rabbis, I think like in your hunting grounds in the south of France, maybe had buried his books because they did think they were heretical. But I think that's a different thing, but maybe not. I just wanted to mention that. But it's that thing in its wonderful story, but it's a cite from Exodus 23:2. After the majority must one incline. I just have a question because I thought it says sort of the opposite, and I know they know how to read these texts, and so I'm asking. Maybe that's not worth spending time on, but I mean, I was just looking at it that don't go after the majority to do evil or something like that. I don't remember the.
Would you want to
no
pull it up
line.
on Sefaria? Are you able to pull it up on Sefaria, or we could pull it?
Yeah, I have.
You want to read? Do you want to read a few verses before and after? Because
Yeah,
I mean, let's.
I don't have the Hebrew text in front of me. I only have this English
Yeah. So,
JPS text.
Let's not forget the last time we came across Rabbi Joshua making a point was when he was arguing with Rabban Gamliel, who also had a traditionalist streak, right? In that one day where all the doors were opened, and there was someone who wanted to convert to Judaism who came up, and he was from one of the 5 nations, right? He was from
Oh, yes.
he was from I can't remember which one was it. He was from one of the 5 nations that the Torah says you shall not accept them into the assembly. Rabban Gamliel was saying, which one was it? Do you remember?
I think he was a Moabite.
He was a Moabite. And so Rabban Gamliel was saying, how can we accept him if we have a Torah verse? And Rabbi Joshua was willing to read much more liberally and creatively and say, well, you know, since we've been exiled from a land and they've been exiled from their land, they're no longer the same Moabites. It's not the same people who live on that land, so that old prohibition doesn't apply anymore. And so Rabbi Joshua, he's willing to read the Torah in all kinds of interesting ways to fit a situation and make it fit the times. Go ahead, you have it?
Phil, what was the?
It's 23, Exodus 23.
Exodus 23?
Yeah.
Which verse?
Let's start verse 1.
I have it. You want me to read?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh. You must not carry false rumors. You should not join hands with the guilty to act as malicious witness. You should neither side with the mighty to do wrong. You should not give perverse testimony in a dispute
Okay.
so as to pervert.
So reread verse 1 and 2, please.
You must not carry false rumors. You should not join hands with the guilty to act as malicious witness. You should neither side with the mighty to do wrong. You should not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty.
Okay. So this is a reading out of context. You know, this is not saying you should always go after the majority, right? It's a reading specific, talking about specific laws. You shall neither side with them. Let's see the Hebrew for that one. Oh. Okay, so this translation doesn't do the justice because beginning is don't go after don't go after the majority to do evil. So he's reading Acharei Rabim Lehatot. He's really reading it out of context. But what he's also quoting is what we've been quoting in this class for the last 3 months, which is what Rabban Gamliel was quoting to Rabbi Joshua and making him come on Yom Kippur with money in his hand. Is the tradition was given from Moses to Joshua, or from Moses to the elders, and from the elders all the way down. And that in some degree, we have to accept that the majority of the elders carry the authority to decide matters of halacha. And so even though he's reading this verse not in its pshat meaning, right, he's kind of twisting it a little bit. And even the lo b'shamayim he, not in the heavens, he's also kind of twisting, right? From the original verse in the Torah, he's saying, Rabbi Joshua is saying, you said to us, it's not in the heavens. And so this is Moses was talking in his final speech to the people and saying, it's not in the heavens, it's not in the skies, it's within your own hearts, right? That's what Moses was saying and all of that, which is powerful. But he also says many other times, it isn't the Torah, it isn't God, it is this. So these are selective readings by Joshua, but Joshua is taking a very firm position in favor of, we have to decide it amongst ourselves, and we're not gonna decide halacha according to your wild ways of bringing miracles. I don't know, Phil, do you have follow-up thoughts? Okay.
Can I interject?
Go ahead. Yeah, Diane, go ahead.
I have the study Bible version of the JPS translation, and the comment in the column says for verse 2, as to pervert it in favor of the mighty, the ambiguity of the Hebrew permitted this to be construed by the rabbis as a separate positive command, meaning, quote, follow the majority in determining the law. As a jurisprudential principle, this meant that in general, judicial rulings and legal questions are to be decided not simply by invoking the literal interpretation of the Torah, nor by invoking new revelations, but by flexible interpretation of the Torah based on the circumstances, as determined by a majority of competent sages.
May I just ask where that comes from? That was very helpful.
It's the JPS Study Bible, and it's just
very
the
good.
commentary on the side, because they have this
Yes,
commentary.
that's extremely helpful. That's exactly parallel to what the lawyers call a negative inference. It says don't incline with the majority or the mighty, the many, to do evil. So therefore, you should incline with them to do good. I guess is that correct? Is that the thinking of the rabbis on that?
And my big question would be, does that come from this story, or is Rabbi Joshua coming from an even earlier tradition to do that, or is it created in this moment, right? Is that tradition created in this moment? So I would have to do research on that, but I mean, it's a pretty bold reading of that verse.
Yeah.
Let's face it, right? That's not what that verse is talking about. And it's kind of like, it's exactly what Rabbi Joshua is talking about with Rabbi Eliezer, right? I am willing to read verses of the Torah in these revolutionary ways to save Judaism, and you're just being worried about being right. I'm trying to save Judaism, and you're just trying to be right, and you're willing to make the walls of the study hall fall on us. So that it makes this moment even more powerful, right? That he's doing it with this verse about, this verse gives the rabbis unlimited power, right? The way he's reading this verse gives the rabbis unlimited power to do whatever they want with the entire tradition, because it's saying, with the majority you shall incline.
They're saying there's no truth except the majority's opinion, right?
Exactly.
There's independent truth. If everybody's comfortable with that, that's fine.
And you mix into that Rabbi Akiva's willingness to say that even every crown and every single letter can be interpreted any way you want. You create a tremendous amount of power in the hands of the rabbis to do whatever they want with the received tradition. They then create all kinds of rules of exegesis, and they kind of go through the whole Talmud is them going back into the Torah on some level and reinterpreting so many laws and trying to create boundaries, but they essentially don't have any boundaries into what they're able to do with the Torah, but they're doing it for a good cause, right? That's what all these texts are about. They're doing it to save Judaism and to adapt Judaism to exile and to adapt Judaism to, the loss of the temple and all these things. But that's kind of the understory to a lot of it. Phil, looks like you're about to say something.
I just want to say, David just made the very controversial point that there's no truth. I mean, according to the rabbis in that theory of the case, but that would make them into kind of sophists. And I think that they don't see themselves that way. I think they think there's a truth and they try to find it. There's I don't think they would agree that whatever they find convenient, that's what we should do, unless they feel that's backed up. But I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that would be. I just want to point out how radical a claim that is. I'm sure he probably would agree that it's not.
Well, they're trying to work out their methodology at this moment. The vision that we have is they're working out their methodology to try and figure out how do we work out truth. And they're creating their own rules, but they're also, I think, probably sincerely believing that there's a continuum with the rules of the past. But there is, that story, that famous story that we read at the beginning of Rabbi Akiba, where Moses is on Mount Sinai and speaking to God, and God is telling him, in the future, your people are still going to be studying Torah, and Moses says, "Oh, I want to see this." And so Moses is suddenly transported into the future, into the study hall of Rabbi Akiba, and he doesn't understand a word of what's happening because. So there was some self, and then he's like, "Whoa, what's going on here? This isn't." And then he hears Rabbi Akiba say, "Well, this is a law from Moses from Sinai," and that comforts him. So it's kind of talking about that tension that the rabbis were aware that what they were doing was a lot of, I wouldn't say it's convenient, but what they felt was right for their moment. So there was some self-awareness that they were taking it to new places, but they felt that they were, by honoring spiritually and honoring the past, that was at least smoothing over some of their discomfort about what they were doing. I don't know, maybe it's hard. I would say the missing piece, and I'm not sure that any scholarship can prove this either way, is in the last 200-300 years of the Second Temple, how much of that is then taken up by the early rabbis, and how much of what the early rabbis has done is an innovation at this moment. I think that's the really big question, which I think scholarship is unsure of. How much of the rabbinic endeavor is created before this moment and these generations, because they try and their own internal story is, oh well, we're just continuing what Hillel and Shammai and the men of the Great Assembly were doing, but how much of that is really true, and how much is it all born in this moment is all, I think, is unclear. Does that make sense, or do you understand what everybody? Because
I would only.
Once you introduce history, which is what we're doing, we're introducing history in some sense, and we're substituting history for truth. So what modern people believe is that there is no truth. That what happens is that people during their time period come to some sort of a consensus about what truth is, and that changes historically in every era. So there is no invariant truth at all. And that's really where we're coming from. That's what our era tells us. And it sounds like the rabbis are very close to that in this thing. So they throw out Rabbi Eliezer, who has some sort of intense intuition, more than an intuition perhaps, that he's onto it truly, that he really knows. And they don't like that, because he's disagreeing with the group that wants to relativize the truth and wants to historize the truth and wants to make the truth sort of, wants to broaden it out and make it open to lots and lots of people who can have opinions, and maybe we count their opinions and we vote on what's the truth. So, this is a big, big issue for everybody.
It is. I think Phil and David, you're both right that there is an element of, it's very radical what they're doing in terms of truth, but you have, one also has to believe that within their own selves, they think that they must think that they're also guided by spirit on some level, and guided by tradition, received tradition, and guided by the past. So they must have that sense too on some level that what they're doing, and also just by talking among themselves. I mean, we have this tradition of elders going back to Moses, which is what we're talking about, right? Moses gave it to the elders. So we have this tradition of elders going back 1,000 years, 1,500 years before them, that it is up to the elders to interpret the written tradition and to interpret the oral tradition. So that is there, that the elders, we have that tradition of elders, and that's what they're basing their own authority on, even as, they are in somewhat precarious ground, because with the temple being destroyed, what makes them the elders? There's these competing people, the Christians they're saying we're the new inheritors, and then there's there's other people, right? The Essenes, I don't know what's left of the Essenes at this point, but they're saying we're the elders. So the rabbis are saying we're the elders, and so we're deciding, and we have to move forward with that. But there are some scholars who believe that in these early days, not that many of the Jewish people were really following the rabbis. We seem to think that, everybody was following the Sanhedrin and the rabbis, but not everybody was. It was kind of like a mixed match. It was interesting. It is a precarious moment. And go ahead.
Thank you. I want to pick up on what David said. I mean, it's extremely important about the historicization, but it's not necessarily true that we have to follow that just because it's the spirit of our age. I mean, you have Leo Strauss kind of crying out against it. I'm not a Leo Straussian, but I can see the point that that if you don't go back to a kind of an absolute stance, you don't know where you're going to end up. But here we're taking a story. I will dare to say it's a legendary account, and we're taking that as the problem that they were facing. But by that time, here's like the 2nd century, the Common Era. It's pretty much believed, I think, among these rabbis, that the time of prophecy, which is very close to these miraculous insights, the time of prophecy is over. The last prophet was Malachi, maybe, and that's all over with. We have to rely on our own resources. So we have this story about a bat kol, a voice from heaven. And all these amazing things happen, and even tries to make it historical by saying, look, that the walls are still leaning over, like it says in the Torah. You could still see the giant iron chair, whatever it was. So there's a mixture of these things, and somebody had to first state the legendary story, and then confront it with this story of the rabbi's interpretation of the verse. That's all.
Interesting. Well, I think I do want to read this very last story of his death. And before that, I wanted to bring that the story that we read of them excommunicating him in the Yerushalmi. The Jerusalem Talmud has an additional little postscript where as he's walking down the street, somehow some garbage falls on his head from I guess an apartment on top. And he says, well, now that the garbage has been falling on top of my head, I know I'm going to be taken back by my brothers. And they say, well, how do you know? He says, well, because of that verse in Psalms, which we say during Hallel, I have rescued you from the rubbish heap, right? I've raised you from the rubbish. And so, but it's kind of saying that he really felt really sad about being excommunicated, or really deeply, he felt deeply saddened by being thrown out of, these were his friends and peers. It was his whole life. and he was thrown out of the study hall and had to spend the last period of his life without that influence. And I just wanted to bring that before, we don't have time to read some of the other stories, they're also interesting. But I want to read at least this last one. Let's go to page 225 and story 102. And Alan, if you wouldn't mind reading.
Sure. I was getting worried. It's like
I
quarter
know.
to 11 and I haven't
Really?
been able to read yet.
Mhm.
Okay. We have been taught when Rabbi Eliezer fell sick, Rabbi Akiba and his companions came to visit him. He was seated in a canopied four-poster while they sat in the reception room. That day was Sabbath Eve, and Rabbi Eliezer's son Hyrcanus came into his father's room to remove the tefillin his father had on. But his father rebuked him, and he retreated crestfallen. It seems to me, Hyrcanus said to them, that my father's mind is deranged. But Rabbi Akiba said to them, Rabbi Eliezer's mind is clear, but Hyrcanus's mind and that of his mother are deranged. How is it that both have neglected acts, kindling Sabbath lights and putting away the Shabbat meal to keep it hot, that are punishable on scriptural authority by stoning if performed on the Shabbat? Well, they concern themselves with tefillin, the wearing of which on the Shabbat is forbidden, not on scriptural, but only on rabbinic authority.
So let's just stop there and explain this. In those days, they wore tefillin all day long. You're not supposed to wear tefillin on Shabbat. So his son, seeing his father is really ill and still wearing tefillin, wants to remove the tefillin from him. And the father rebukes him. And he's, his feelings are hurt. And he's like, it seems like father's mind is gone. But Rabbi Akiba defends him and says, well, you're worried about the tefillin, but there's more important things. It does make Eliezer seem a little harsh, right? Let's continue reading.
The sages, persuaded that his mind was clear, entered Rabbi Eliezer's room and sat down at a distance of 4 cubits from him. Why have you come? He asked.
Wait, let's just go back, read note 7.
As a
No,
restrict-
not 7. Because Rabbi Eliezer had been placed under the ban.
That's why they sat 4 cubits from him. Go ahead.
The sages persuaded.
Why have you come?
Why have you come? He asked. We have come to study Torah, they replied. And why did you not come before now? He asked. We had no time, they replied. Then he said to them, I wonder if such as you will die a natural death. When Rabbi Akiba asked, and what kind of death will be mine, he answered. Yours will be more cruel than theirs. Then Rabbi Eliezer placed his arms over his heart and bewailed them, saying, Alas for you, arms of mine, that are like 2 Torah scrolls about to be rolled up and put away. Much Torah I have learned, and much have I taught. Much Torah have I learned, yet I have not taken from my teachers, even as much as the water a dog laps up from the sea. Much Torah I taught, yet my disciples have taken from me no more than a paint stick picks up from its tube. Moreover, I have studied 300 laws on the subject of a bright discoloration of the skin. I have studied 300 rules about planting
Wait,
cucumbers.
you didn't finish that sentence. The bright discoloration on the skin, yet.
Yet no man has ever asked me about that.
Even more.
Even more, I have studied 300 rules about planting cucumbers by magic. And no man other than Akiva ben Joseph ever asked me about that. Once, while he and I were walking on a road, he said to me, "My master, teach me the planting of cucumbers by magic." I uttered a single word, and the whole field about us was filled with cucumbers. Then he said, "Master, you just taught me how to plant them. Now teach me how to pluck them." I uttered another word, and all the cucumbers gathered into one place. Then his disciples kept asking him about the laws of cleanliness, of cleanness, and the laws of uncleanness. Concerning that which was clean, kept saying, concerning that which was unclean, he kept saying unclean. And concerning that which was clean, he kept saying clean, until his soul departed as he uttered the word clean. Then Rabbi Joshua stood up and exclaimed, "The ban is lifted, the ban is lifted."
Let's stop there. What do you make of this story?
It seems like he's saying, or he's feeling that he knows so much, but nobody wants to ask him about it or listen to what he has to say. Maybe is more to the point, except for, one person.
You feel the same character as a guy who was saying, if the halakha is like me, let the tree be upplanted, the guy who knows so much and who's. It's a moving story though, right, isn't it? Because there's a good ending in the end. He's rehabilitated on some level. The sages, they bring him back. They're willing to, or Rabbi Joshua is willing to bring him back.
I don't know, wouldn't it be better if they brought him back while he's still alive?
Sure.
I mean, it seems like he dies and nothing had changed. Once he dies, they say, maybe we made a mistake,
Easier to have him back when he's dead.
Easier when he's, yeah. Well, who knows what you'll do to your cucumbers, right? He's gonna put all the cucumber peppers out.
It's a very moving, poignant story about this guy, and he's still quite bitter. It's clear
Yes.
that nobody has tapped his great wisdom, and he's also saying that he hasn't learned that much from other people too. So he's sort of an enclosed potato. This guy.
Yeah, well, he's humble until the end, but he's bitter. We see with his son, he has that edge his whole life, or maybe, but from the beginning he's a bit of he studies Torah so strongly when he's a youth that his breath smells, right, because he doesn't take care of his. So he's always got that bit of edgy side. His breath smells. Maybe he's a little of an extreme ascetic. On the other hand, but people need to learn how to deal with these people. Rabbi Akiba is the only one who really knows how to deal with it, because who's Rabbi Akiba? He's the one with a foot in each world, right? He's the one who goes up to the heavenly orchard and knows how to come down. And so he's the one who can deal with this kind of guy. And but Rabbi Akiba, he's also the one who's smart enough to ask him about his knowledge. I mean, it'd be pretty cool to know how to harvest cucumbers in this way, and nobody else dares to ask him, but they're walking, and Rabbi Akiba wants to know, and so he's asking him about the cucumber harvesting trick.
Yet
Yeah.
Rabbi Akiva gets the brunt of this, right? I mean, he predicts, even though Rabbi Akiva understands, Rabbi Akiva is the one who's been sent to excommunicate him, because Rabbi Akiva has those people skills, right?
Yeah.
But even in this story, he lashes out at Rabbi Akiva by saying your death is going to be the worst of all of them. And we know what happens to Rabbi Akiva, but
Yeah.
for Rabbi Eliezer to point that out to the one rabbi who has been sympathetic to him this entire time is it's off-putting. It's very off-putting, and it goes to the inflexibility that Rabbi Eliezer continues to show in cleaving to the word, not the spirit, but the word of the Lord.
So interesting, right? Because Rabbi Akiva is not only one who has a foot in the orchard and a foot out of the orchard, but he's also the one who cares about the rabbinic enterprise in with so deeply. He cares about the received tradition, but he also cares about it moving forward, right? He's the one who's so creative and does all these creative things. But Rabbi Eliezer kind of lacks. Rabbi Eliezer is a traditionalist. He doesn't want to change things. He just wants to keep it kind of the same. And so, but as you said, there's something kind of not very nice about him saying that to Rabbi Akiva. He has the spiritual vision to foresee it, but he doesn't say it in the nicest way, right? He's not, and he's mean to his own son. But I mean, I really think we see these characters so present in Judaism in our day, all these different kind of characters. I mean, in the ultra-Orthodox world, you see the Rabbi Eliezers everywhere, right? The people who are only care about the tradition and the power, and there is a power to the tradition. And then you see those. It's why the early conservative rabbis loved all these stories, because they saw themselves as the Rabbi Akivas and the Rabbi Joshuas, because they felt we love the tradition, but we're also more flexible. We want to, work with it. Maybe they lost some of the power, but
may I ask a question about the previous paragraph?
Yeah.
Is also interesting. It's so dense with interesting problems. But when they come into his room and he asks, now he's at this point, they're staying far so many cubits from him because they've excommunicated him, right? And they try and follow their own rule. But he says, why have you come? We came to study Torah. So they think he has Torah to teach them, even though they've excommunicated him from the community that follows the Torah. And why did you not come before now? And the answer is, it's really very funny it sounds like a James Thurber story. We had no time. They were too busy to come before. That's why they didn't come before. Actually, that is right out of, anyway, what do you make of that? And he then it's when he says, I wonder if people like you can die a natural death. That's pretty sharp. If I were,
they're trying to placate. They're placating a dying man on one level, right? But if we would read the earlier stories, which I encourage you to read, there was never a doubt that he had Torah to teach them. There never was a doubt. Even as he was excommunicated, they knew he had what to teach them. And I mean, the question is, why are they visiting him? Are they visiting him because they want to honor him at least in his last moments for what he did, even though he's excommunicated? Do they want to visit him because they want to get some last bits of Torah they'll never hear anywhere else, like how to harvest cucumbers or be in his presence? Is it because they feel guilty about that they had to excommunicate? They felt that they had to, but it's a very fraught moment, right? And before we break, let's read the very end. So Alan, since you've been doing it, let's just finish.
Okay, at the end of the Sabbath, on the way between Caesarea and Lydda, Rabbi Akiva met Rabbi Eliezer's beard. In his grief, Rabbi Akiva lacerated his flesh until the blood dripped on the ground, and sobbing and moaning, he lamented, "Woe is me for the loss of you, woe is me for the loss of you, my master, for you have left an entire generation fatherless." In the mourner's row, he began his eulogy with Elisha's words at the departure of Elijah. my father, the chariots of Israel and the horsemen thereof. I have many coins, but no money changer to sort them out. When Rabbi Eliezer died, the Torah scroll was hidden away. The book of wisdom was hidden away.
So, right, Elijah was, right when Elijah dies, and Elisha sees Elijah, or Elisha says to Elijah, Elijah asks his disciple Elisha, what do you want from me? And Elisha says, I want double your spirit, right? And Elijah says, I'll only give it to you if you see me when I die, then you will be given that. And he sees him taken away up to heaven. But for him to call Eliezer like Elijah is a big claim, because it's saying he's like a prophet, he had that power with him. And maybe he's calling himself like Elisha, that he's taking on some of that mantle, of holding both the spiritual power, but also what he had the other. So very, 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 very rich story at the end. Rabbi Akiba, despite it all, really honors him and his legacy. And maybe they just needed him aside during his life because he was too destructive a presence. But the amazing that all of this was recorded and kept within the tradition of the conversation, and we're continuing 2,000 years later about its place within Judaism, within religion, within our lives. But this is really an important internal dialogue that we're all carrying. Not sure yet what we'll do next week, but this concludes Rabbi Eliezer, and we'll continue our study soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very good. Yeah, very good.
Thank you very much. Very
Thank you.
interesting.
Rabbi, what book is this from?
This is from Bialik's Book of Legends. So what it's called?
The deed of fathers?
No, this is it's Bialik who put together all of the midrashim and oral stories, and it was translated into English. It's a great volume. I'll send you a link. It's a
Thank
great
you.
volume. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.